Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Web Platform Podcast. Episode number 140, the big 140, overview of Couchbase. We are your hosts today, Justin Cabrera, Danny Blue, and Amal Hussein. Danny, Amal, good to see you. How's things?
Things are going pretty good, Justin.
Hi, everyone.
Have your build tools rejected you this week already?
Yes.
It's a little early this week.
Yes, 100%. I spent almost 2 hours yesterday trying to configure rollup to do something correctly.
And those are 2 hours you'll never get back.
Yeah.
But the web is better for it.
That's what they tell me.
That's what they tell you. Today we're talking about Couchbase, and I want to welcome our guests this week, Nick and Matt. Nick, Matt, thanks for joining us. Thanks for coming on the show.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Definitely.
So if you would be so kind as to tell everyone a little bit about yourself. What do y'all do? How have you come to be about the Couchbase?
I'll let Matt start this one off.
Yeah, I'm a developer advocate for Couchbase, which means that I like to work with developers to increase their awareness of Couchbase and get their feedback about Couchbase, help them use Couchbase to solve business problems. So I'm going to a lot of conferences, writing blog posts, active on social media, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I am Nick Raboy, and I am in California. I live, I think, close to Justin. But I'm also a developer advocate at Couchbase. I primarily focus on server-side stuff, so Node.js, Go, Java, that kind of stuff. And I do a little bit of the mobile things, a little bit of Android, a little bit of iOS. So you might see some material from me online, or maybe I'm at an event and I'm speaking on it. But I do mostly the same stuff that Matt does.
It's always interesting when I meet developer advocates. Everyone's got a different approach to developer advocacy in terms of reaching out to developers and whatnot. And I'm just curious. I mean, when you go out there and talk to developers, you just mentioned, Nick, that you work sort of on a wide range of platforms. It seems like a lot of people work on a wide range of platforms today. Like, I remember the day, because Justin's old and crickety at this point, where people had focus and there was one thing and they wrote COBOL and that was it. But these days, as a developer advocate, you sort of have to have a lot of tools in your tool belt, don't you?
Yeah, definitely. You definitely need to be a full stack developer. You can't just get by doing just COBOL. But everyone has their own freedom to choose what stack works best for them.
Yeah, I would say I'm a little more focused than Nick. I'm a little more towards the Microsoft side of things. So I spend a lot of time with ASP.NET and C#, but I do dabble in JavaScript and Node from time to time.
And the beauty of Couchbase is that you can use it with all these things. So maybe tell us a little bit about what is Couchbase for those out there who may be confusing it with something else that has the word couch in it.
Yeah, so Couchbase is actually a NoSQL database. So it's a key value store and a document database. There's many different types of NoSQL databases out there. There's the document kind of standard. There's graph databases, tabular databases, all different kinds. And then a lot of people may have heard of CouchDB, which has a similar name to Couchbase, but they're definitely not the same thing. And maybe Matt wants to talk a little bit about that.
Sure, and this also will kind of get into what Couchbase is and what the value proposition of Couchbase is. So if I could just take you on a little bit of a history here, back to the far distant early web days of 2009. Just try to put yourself in the frame of mind of 2009. I know it's so long ago. But there still are open source project called CouchDB. It's under the Apache Foundation. And there's another open source project called memcached. And these two things were sort of living separately, and companies formed around them. So CouchDB, a company called Couch One, formed around it, and they provided CouchDB support. I made the mistake myself there. They provided CouchDB support, and another company arose called Membase, and they provided support around memcached. And these companies were going along doing their thing. And again, this is kind of before my time, but they decided that maybe their chocolate and peanut butter would go better together So they merged and formed a company called Couchbase. You get Couch 1 and Membase, put them together, Couchbase. And they created a new piece of software called Couchbase Server. And that's where the Couchbase roots come from. So you have the memory architecture of Memcache together with the persistent store, JSON persistent store of CouchDB together in one convenient package.
So that's super powerful and interesting, and also kudos to you for bringing these two really powerful technologies together. So I mean, I'm very familiar with the old CouchDB, and I think a lot of people think of that as, when they think of Couchbase, they even still think it's the same. But can you talk a little bit more about when that happened and where Couchbase is in its versioning and all of that good stuff?
Yeah, that happened around 2009, 2010 is when that merger first happened. And I'm not sure when Couchbase Server 1 was released, but somewhere after that point, I would imagine. Right now, we're in Couchbase. We're just about ready to release Couchbase Server 5. So that's how far we've come along in the versions. In comparison, CouchDB, I think they just released, in the last 6 months or a year, released CouchDB version 2. So you can see some of the iterations that have happened to Couchbase. It's come a long way since those early days. Added a lot of features. It very much started out as a key value store, as Nick alluded to there. But along the way, we've added JSON document storage. We've added a query language called Nickel, which is SQL for a NoSQL database. And we've added things like full text search and different options for memory optimization, indexes, all kinds of features we've added to Couchbase over the years. Sometimes because it's a cool feature, and sometimes because it's something that our customers have asked us for.
That's great. And Couchbase is open source, is that correct?
Yeah, Couchbase is open source, Apache license. And just to elaborate on that a little bit, there's the community edition of Couchbase Server, and there's also the enterprise edition of Couchbase Server. For the most part, they're pretty much the same. Couchbase Community Edition is actually a release behind. That's a pretty typical model for open source companies. And additionally, there are a few features in Enterprise Edition that are enterprise only. But for the most part, you can get up and running with Couchbase Community. It's a free download, free license, open source. Do whatever you like with it. Enterprise, of course, you're free to download it and try it out. It's also a free download. You can use Enterprise Edition in dev, test, or QA, but you'll need a license to go into prod with that.
And Matt, I've already gone ahead and provided Amal with a link to the edition description. So if she wants to add that to the show notes, everyone can go in and look, and there's a nice little table that clearly defines what you get in both editions.
Yeah, I mean, I love that model, by the way. It's really great. I think what's also very unique about it is, you kind of guarantee full backwards compatibility, and so people can kind of migrate back and forth between the versions easily. So that's very cool, too. Different types of editions, I mean.
So when you talk about sort of your initial starting points, where do you typically start in a sort of Couchbase world? If I want to get started in Couchbase today as a developer, what is your common sort of approach to that?
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and take that. So a lot of times when you think about NoSQL, you think maybe you don't need a data model. Maybe it's so flexible that you can just develop as you go. But when it comes to development, at least for me, the first thing I think about is my data model. Even with being able to be flexible, you still kind of need an idea on what you plan on storing and how you plan on storing it. Otherwise, it could easily turn into chaos. So you figure out how you want to store your data, and then you go ahead and get Couchbase up and running. I'd say that's where you would start. I don't know if Matt has any opinions on that as well.
No, I think that makes sense to start thinking about your model first, and then As far as getting started with Couchbase, it's a very quick install. It can run on Windows, Mac, or a number of Linux distros. You can just get up and running really quickly. Just a couple of just a download and a couple of quick steps, and you'll be ready to go.
So, from a data model perspective, Couchbase sort of uses documents, right? They're JSON documents straight across the form. They have a pretty simple representation that, as a web developer, you've probably seen, objects of this type with these sorts of things. How does it handle things like relationships? Like, how do you end up doing things like one-to-many? Are you using sort of embedded documents, or are you using sort of SQL-like references in terms of things, foreign key style, which noSQL doesn't typically do?
I can take this one, Nick, because I've been working on this just today, in fact, working on some material for data modeling. So you're right in that the fundamental piece of data in a document database is that document is a piece of JSON. And with Couchbase, it's just literal JSON. If you're familiar with JSON, you know how to store data in Couchbase. As far as modeling goes, you have the flexibility to take a number of different approaches depending on your use cases, your data writing or data reading patterns. So when you're talking a piece of data by itself, you can imagine a very flat JSON document. That's pretty easy to model. You just have a number of key value pairs in a JSON object, and you're set to go. What you're talking about is actually relating pieces of data to each other, more complex pieces of data. So just as an example, just to think about something simple we could talk about on a podcast, imagine you're trying to model a shopping cart. And so in a relational database, you might take an approach of, okay, I have a shopping cart table. It has one row in it. And then I might have items that go in that shopping cart. And that might be a separate table with multiple rows that map to the first table via foreign key. Pretty standard approach there. With a document database, you can model this in two different ways if you want to. You can model it in the traditional style where you have one document representing the shopping cart, and you can have separate documents for each item in that shopping cart. So you have, in the relational, you have 4 rows of data. In a document database, you'd have 4 documents. Now, you can do that approach, and sometimes that is the appropriate course of action. But the other approach you can take is you can denormalize that data. So you can have a single shopping cart document that contains the shopping cart information as well as an array of items that go into that shopping cart. I'm going to pause for a second here because there's a fire truck coming by.
Well, this is a very hot topic. I think that's what the fire truck is saying.
Yeah, dude, you're on fire, man.
I thought that was a very apt pun, Danny.
I love that joke. I don't know what you're talking about.
And the dogs are all barking in the neighborhood too. They are the fire truck. They're all howling. It's great.
Yeah, well, I did want to add on to what Matt was saying. So when you do that kind of referred approach, not the embedded approach, you do have to really control that via your application layer. The database isn't going to yell at you if you violate some kind of rule, like you would in a relational database with the primary and foreign key. So that'd be up to you to maintain.
I always find that to be the hardest part when it comes to NoSQL, just from growing up in sort of a land of sort of relational databases and schemes of terribleness that starts with an O. But if I say their name, they'll probably sue us because that's the big O company. I'm always curious, like, how does one, like, when you're talking to developers out there about that sort of thing, about the notion that you really have to manage those sorts of sets when you're doing sort of related information. How do you sort of approach that? Like, what are some methodologies that one might use to sort of maintain sort of the sanity around the sort of documents that one would create within a NoSQL store like Couchbase?
So, I mean, first of all, when we're out and about, we're not selling Couchbase as the only technology that you should ever choose. There's a technology that fits every purpose. So if somebody really absolutely needs that highly relational model, then maybe it's a good idea that they stick with some kind of relational database. But when it comes to working with a NoSQL database, and they get that power of, well, they're putting JSON into the database and they're getting JSON out of the database, and they can define their model around it. And it's all right that the database doesn't maintain those rules. Then things start to click together.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I'd agree with Nick for sure in that we're not saying that NoSQL or Couchbase is a silver bullet that solves all data problems and you can drop all of those big O instances tomorrow. There is a trade-off here, and in some cases you want to trade off and get flexibility of the way you store data versus the enforcing of the data structure at the database level. So sometimes that trade-off's worth it, and sometimes it is not.
Now, you also get other advantages, though, when you're working with a NoSQL database. I mean, for one, it's a distributed database. So if you're talking about these databases like the Big O, where you've got this one really beefy database, it's very expensive to run on very expensive servers. Well, it's probably going to be a little cheaper in a NoSQL database because you've got many nodes in a cluster. They could be much smaller, easier to maintain. So there's other things that come with it along with that data flexibility on why it's beneficial.
And one of the big things that Couchbase is very good at is that notion of the scale of it. We talk a lot about data, and the biggest problem with typical relation data is that it can be hard to scale unless you're spending quite a bit of money and putting in quite a bit of architecture. But Couchbase scales rather well pretty much out of the box. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah.
So the way Couchbase works is, so you start with a single node, right? Then you decide, you know what, maybe I need more power. So you add another node to the server, to the cluster. Each node in the cluster is actually peer-to-peer. There's no master-slave kind of architecture in Couchbase. So when you add these nodes to the cluster, you know what, they're all the same, and the data is defined to each of the SDKs through what's called the cluster map. And that's how they know which node has what data, because the data is in the end automatically sharded across that cluster. So no node in that cluster has like 100,000 more records than another node. So it tries to keep it as balanced as possible.
Yeah, and I would just say this is because of the architecture that Couchbase went with back in the long ago days of 2010. It makes it easier to scale. And it's also easier to scale linearly. Each node in the Couchbase cluster can do both reads and writes, as opposed to some other databases like Relational Model or even some NoSQL databases. You have that master-slave where the master can become the bottleneck, and you're not really taking full advantage of all those machines in your cluster. So your scaling, maybe at first it'll start out and it'll be okay, but you'll eventually plateau. Whereas Couchbase, you can just keep adding more and more nodes, and you'll get that linear scaling as you add those nodes. So you're using the resources to the fullest that you can.
So I'm really glad you brought up that point. So one of the things that kind of interested me about Couchbase is the fact that there is no master-slave relationship, right? There's any node in the cluster can become the orchestrator, which is like a no-brainer if you think about it. But I mean, I think you guys might be the only ones doing that. So can you maybe elaborate a little bit about how that really helps people scale? And then also, would you mind talking a little bit about all the different services that you offer within Couchbase and how, from my understanding, you can, as an admin, you can kind of allocate your memory. You can allocate your RAM versus CPU on the various services extremely flexibly, like within how you allocate for a single node. So
yeah, so what you just led on to, there's actually a name for it within Couchbase. So it's called multidimensional scaling. And what that offers is it allows you to scale each node's services differently if you want to. So by default, you have the possibility of having a data service, indexing service, query service, and then now in 5.0, a full text search service. And by default, all of those, if you have them turned on, they're going to be scaled evenly. So they're going to get the same kind of allocations. But if you wanted to scale them differently, you have that opportunity, and that's just through a click of your mouse. It's not you don't have to go to the terminal or anything like that to do some crazy voodoo to make this work. It was all designed to be very easy for the administrator or even the developer, if the developer is the administrator.
That's super cool, and you have a really beautiful UI. I'm using an older version of Couchbase right now, but the new version, I think version 5, it's like a completely revamped UI. Can you talk a little bit about how you've made that really easy for someone like me who's very little actual database experience?
Yeah, one of the things I like about Couchbase is what you've just talked about, is that you get a nice UI out of the box with Couchbase, and you don't have to issue a bunch of arcane command lines or install something, some other piece of software to get that functionality. Now, Couchbase, if you like the command line, you like REST APIs, Couchbase has all that stuff. But I like that when you install Couchbase, you get that nice UI out of the box. It shows you what's going on. You can click around and just fumble around with Couchbase and get your bearings and see what you can do and what's available out there. I think usability is something that everyone likes usability, even developers. We always like using the command line. We always it makes us look cool when using the command line. But when we're just getting started, that usability is very important for you to understand what's going on. And I really like that about Couchbase when I first started using it. You mentioned the new UI. Yeah, this is true. We revamped the UI, and I believe we used, and you're gonna have to help me with this, the Google.
It's material design. Yeah, it's called. Yeah, it's material design.
We use material design to create that UI, and we made some changes to the UI in order to one, make things easier for you to use as a developer, and two, we wanted to change our UI because we were sort of running out of some nav space for features, and it was making things harder to use. So we changed the UI pretty dramatically, I think, to help expand our new features and just to make things easier for you as a developer. And Nick, anything else you want to say about the UI?
Yeah, I wanted to actually dive a little bit deeper because so we've said that the UI is great, but we don't really say what the UI, what you can do with the UI. So, I mean, for one, you have the ability to access your documents. You have a visual interface for seeing what your documents are, how many you've got, what they look like when you want to drill in deeper to them. But you also have the ability to query for those documents. So, like Matt had brushed on earlier, Couchbase has a technology that we're calling Nickel, N1QL. This is like a SQL-like syntax, so you could actually write SQL queries and query for that data and display it in a different number of ways. In addition to that being in the UI, you have the ability to create new user roles. You can create indexes. You can do full text search through that interface. There's a lot of different things you can do through the UI, something that a lot of other databases, relational and NoSQL included, don't really have unless you download a third-party tool.
That's super cool, and you have a fully interactive console as well, right, within the UI to be able to use those to make queries and is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, that's correct.
And one thing I want to bring up about the UI you just mentioned, the query workbench is what we call it. One of the things we've added in Couchbase 5 is a visual plan that you can actually see the individual parts of the query plan, so you can better create indexes. So you can know what's the most expensive part of the query, what should I focus on, why is this query taking so long, and you can get a visual representation of that query plan that you can start with when you're trying to tune and tweak your queries.
Okay, so I actually got to see this firsthand, and this was amazing. Basically, if I'm correct, you can make a query and you can kind of turn on almost like a logging level where you can see for every part of the JSON that gets returned, what was used to fetch it. So you can really optimize and performance tune, and you can see what's expensive, what's not, what's indexed, what's not. It's super cool. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. And it's useful because you can create a lot of indexes. And when you write queries and execute them, they may return data, but they may not be using the index that you thought you had created. And you definitely want your applications to be fast. If you have a query that takes longer than a couple milliseconds, nowadays that's pretty slow. So you definitely want to be able to optimize, and being able to do this through the UI is definitely a big thing. And then, like I think you brought up, or Matt brought up, about the CLI, there is a CLI that you could use if you prefer the terminal, and do all of this stuff there as well.
That's super cool. So do you guys elaborated on I hinted a little bit about Nickel, this NoSQL-like language that you have. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so a big thing when it came to NoSQL, and first of all, I actually came from a relational database world, so I did a lot of relational database development. So I was really familiar with SQL. Coming to NoSQL, that's a big jump, because how do you query for this data? What do you have to do? So it's something a lot of developers struggle with, I think. So Couchbase actually took a lot of that pain out by creating Nickel, which allows you to use a flavor of SQL to query for your JSON documents. So you have the opportunity to use operators like the select operator, insert, things like that. But you also get to take it a step further and use things like join, and a lot of operators that go against very nested JSON data. So if you wanted to query for data in maybe an array of objects that have arrays in them, you could do SQL-like queries to get that information and return just the information you need server side, rather than having to do any kind of multiple manipulations in your application layer. That made sense.
Yes, no, that's super cool and super powerful. And so basically, if I'm correct, Nickel is kind of pretty much I think it's almost everything that SQL has, except for little queries like create database, create table, drop table. Is that right? Like you can pretty much do everything else?
For everything I've used it for, yes. I haven't found any limitations to what I would have seen in a relational database. I'm not saying that there may not be limitations. It's just, as a standard developer, I have not run into them. Maybe Matt can explain a little bit more if he's run into any limitations.
Yeah, I mean, there are a few minor things that would make it not as complete as other SQL implementations, but it is ANSI SQL compliant as far as I know. You get select, update, insert, delete, merge, subqueries, joins, as Nick mentioned, aggregation, some other additional stuff that you need for JSON data that you wouldn't need in tables. And Nick kind of alluded to that in terms of nesting and unnesting arrays and addressing object hierarchies and things like that. It's all there.
That's very, very cool. And I mean, for me, it's really easy to get other developers on board. So I started using Couchbase on a new project, and it was super easy for me to get other people on board because of Nickel. They were like, oh, okay, they're less apprehensive about trying out a NoSQL database for the first time. So it's a great decision on your part for adding in that feature. So can you?
Now, just to survey you for a second, would you say that being able to query was a big thing? Was that kind of the blocker that prevented you
not
from
for me,
choosing NoSQL
but for others, yes, they kind of are like, well, how do we even interact with this thing, right? I mean, we have like years of being able to do custom SQL queries, and we want that flexibility, and so I think it got them over the hurdle of using a NoSQL database for the first time. All right, not having to use like JavaScript like syntax, for example, right?
Awesome.
And this is for non-JavaScript developers. But so yeah.
Querying is a tough thing. I think the kicker is that for so many who, I mean, I don't. It's funny, but I find it very hard to find good DBAs these days. Like, I know you're out there, DBAs, and if you're out there, I'd love to hear from you. But you seem to be hiding in the world. Because initially, I don't know how everyone learned SQL here. I don't know if everyone even knows SQL anymore. It's a very strange thing to me that in terms of querying things, we have so many different ways to get data in and out of things, be it REST APIs and everything else. I mean, for a lot of systems now, you just ping the REST API with things, and you have some query params, and it kind of SQL-ish. You're selecting things, but it's not purely SQL. So SQL always has a pretty solid place in my heart, generally, primarily because I still use it every day. So I think it's nice. I've looked at the language reference for Nickel. It's pretty standard stuff. It doesn't look like anything sort of out of the norm. So if you're interested, if you're out there thinking, you know what, I want to take a look at this Nickel thing, and one keyword maybe.
I wanted to add on this too. So,
and
are you guys familiar with
yes.
ORMs by chance? Yeah. So ORMs is an object relational map, right? So a similar concept is in Couchbase as well. So if you're a Node developer, you can use what's called Ottoman, which is an ODM, an object document model. And this will actually allow you to model your documents based on how you would kind of expect model your objects based on how you'd find them in the database, and then use a different kind of API for querying or creating or handling a relationship. And it doesn't just stop at Node. I mean, Java, a lot of people use Spring Data, Hibernate, things like that. That kind of stuff is still allowed if you're not much of a query writer yourself. I think maybe Matt can jump in on this, but I think Link does something similar.
Yeah, there's a link provider called Link to Couchbase. So for all you .NET C# guys out there, you can use a link query and it will generate Nickel behind the scenes and execute that Nickel, return the results, and put them in your POCOs, or in the case of Java, it is POJOs. But I'm mostly focused on Microsoft here, so we're talking Link to Couchbase.
Yeah, Link is
That's
really
pretty
nice
cool.
for those of you who have never used Link, and I realize this is the web platform podcast, but I'll put a notch in there for Link. I really like Link.
No, Link's great.
Link is awesome, and I wish other things worked as well as Link most of the time.
Well, so you know what's interesting about for me
My
anyway
2 cents.
about the model that you have is that you have really good ODMs that you can use with SDKs, and then you can also within the same application architecture you use querying, right? So for me, I have a bunch of analytics stuff that I'm trying to query. So for that, I use Nickel, and for other simple things, I use the SDK. And so being able to kind of like mix and match that is super cool for me personally. And then in my previous experience, like ORMs have been like the single source of bottleneck for web applications, right? Like being able to scale, move flexibly, the performance hits. There's all kinds of issues that we've had in the past. So it's really, it's nice and refreshing to be able to kind of have this much flexibility. So again, kudos to you. As you can tell, I'm a complete fangirl. So.
I love it.
Awesome.
So coming from me, who has almost no experience with databases, we've talked about some on the show before. Is Couchbase reactive, like similar to things like RethinkDB?
I don't actually have any experience with RethinkDB, so I won't be of any help there. But are you talking about reactive from a developer perspective, like an SDK, or something else?
So I'm curious mostly from the SDK point of view, like the developer experience.
Yeah, so I mean, you could actually use RX Java. I don't know if you're familiar with that. I know that there's RxJS and RX.NET, but as far as support goes for Couchbase, as of right now, you can actually use RX Java for asynchronous stuff with Java, but the other stuff is likely to come in the future.
Uh-huh. All right. Well, thanks very much.
All right, so maybe we can get into Couchbase Mobile. So can you talk a little bit about what Couchbase Mobile is? And there's the sync gateway, and so there's all this cool support for offline and being able to store certain types of data locally. Is that correct?
Yeah, so Couchbase Mobile is kind of a three kind of tier platform. So there's different components to Couchbase Mobile. You've got Couchbase Lite, which is an embeddable version of Couchbase that you use as a replacement to just using SQLite or core data on your mobile device. So this acts as a standalone mobile database for Android and iOS. Then you've got Couchbase Server, which is part of Couchbase Mobile, which is, of course, the cloud database. And then you've got that middleware piece, which is called Couchbase Sync Gateway, and that's responsible for synchronizing data between Couchbase Lite and Couchbase Server, because Couchbase Lite is just a client-facing database. Client-facing things should never have direct access to your database, your cloud database. So instead, you have Couchbase Sync Gateway, which handles all of that middle tier stuff to prevent any kind of security holes. And so what happens is when you're synchronizing, so it's designed to be offline first. So when you have an internet connection, synchronization will happen. You'll get data pushed up, you'll get data pulled down. But when that internet connection goes away, you want to be able to still maintain a copy of that data. And that's what happens. So Couchbase Lite, every interaction you make with Couchbase Lite is done locally. And in the background, it does that sync. So when you lose that internet connection, you can feel safe that you still have a functioning mobile application.
And that's super cool. And so to put it into context, if you really want to make certain things go zoom, 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 right? Like you have a list, like a list of states and countries, right? You don't need to constantly query for that, right? You can kind of store that on the user's device. Is that?
Yeah, so you can decide what gets stored. You definitely have that opportunity to do data partitioning. So I mean, chances are you've got a ton of data in your Couchbase server database, potentially terabytes of data. The phone, you got what, 16 gigabytes of data? I don't know what the storage is nowadays, but it's not that much. So you definitely want to be able to decide, well, what data should end up on my device and what data shouldn't be. So that's a thing. You also get that flexible model on your mobile device. You're no longer working with relational data through SQLite, or I don't know much about iOS, but I think core data is like an ORM kind of thing. But you don't have to worry about that anymore. You've got the same flexibility that you would have in Couchbase Server.
So do you also have control over kind of how things the scenario I'm thinking of is that if you have some data that you need to make sure is up to date as much as possible, and then you have another set of data that is still needs to be kept up to date, but it's not as maybe not as important. So something that is a bit more static, but we still need to check every once in a while to make sure it's up to date. Do you have that level of control over the syncing process?
Yeah, so you can actually create listeners inside of your mobile application. And you can listen for things on different levels. So you can listen for changes to the entire local database. You can listen for changes on a document level or on a query level. So you can define what happens, and you could also manipulate your push and pull replicators based around this to give you that kind of flexibility. And there's scenarios where you might want to create many different listeners.
Excellent.
That's super cool, and of course we're talking about offline behavior. So I'm gonna have to ask, what is there a mobile web story for Couchbase, right? So for users that are interested in building progressive web apps with offline storage and whatnot.
So I think there's a loose story, and people will may tell you different stories depending on who you ask. But a popular one for a long time has been PouchDB, because Couchbase had similar APIs to what CouchDB offered. So PouchDB tended to work to a certain extent, and PouchDB is a browser-based alternative. It's not supported. It's not supported by Couchbase. It's not maintained by Couchbase, but it worked for the most part. I wouldn't rely too much on that. I think things are changing in the next version of Couchbase. But that's not to say that a mobile kind of web story for PWAs may not happen in the future, because it potentially will happen. But that's kind of out of our timeline, I think, right now. And I don't know if Matt wants to make comment on that as well.
Yeah, just to make that clear, PouchDB and the Sync Gateway API were relatively close. So the Sync Gateway API, relatively close to the CouchDB API. That is something that I think is going to be changing. But Couchbase is a relatively small company, and we have very limited resources. So we have to focus on, we can't put every single feature in. But if that being said, if enough customers or enough developers who are interested in Couchbase want a more cohesive PWA story, that's something that it's our job as developer advocates to communicate to the rest of the organization, to say, hey, there's 1,000 people out there who would use Couchbase if there was a better PWA story. So that's part of our job as advocates, is to convey that information.
Feature tracking can always be hard, I find. Everybody wants everything under the sun. It's no different on any platform that you sort of work on. It's tough to sort of manage those expectations, though, isn't it? You always end up with the corporate side of life, and then you've got the developer ease side of life. And this has been a big topic. We've talked about it on the show before as well, but it's kind of a ongoing burn of a topic these days in developer circles. The notion of, who do you make tools and things for? Are you making it for users? Do you make it for developers? Is speed the trade-off as opposed to reliability? Those sorts of things always sort of start to bubble, particularly when you start to get a lot of traction, as you guys have. You're going to end up with wow, that's a laundry list of things you want, and I'd like to see my children next week, so thanks, but we're going to have to make some cuts.
Yeah, totally agree with you.
And so, and speaking of adoption, I mean, can you guys maybe highlight? I really feel like you guys have kind of there's this hockey stick effect that every startup in the world wants. When they're asking investors for money, they're like, and we're gonna grow this much. And so, but you guys kind of really are growing this much. Can you talk a little bit about some of the big names that are now using Couchbase?
Yeah, definitely Couchbase, not Couch. But anyone here familiar with Pokemon Go?
Never heard of it.
Never heard of it. Yeah,
my kids don't drag me around all the time to play it. No, never.
Yeah, so this company is a huge customer of Couchbase. So they're using it to power their profile store for Pokemon Go, which is great. Very relevant application, mobile game, and they found it very effective to be able to scale with all of the, I don't know the number of users. I see everyone still playing it for outside, but there's a lot of people using it. That's just one of many stories. I don't know if Matt wants to shed any light on some cool.
Yeah, I think one of our really big customers you may have heard of is LinkedIn, and they're using us for a similar reason. I think they started using us as a cache. So a lot of our customers start out using Couchbase as a cache because of that memcache history I talked about earlier. But I think they've also expanded use cases to use LinkedIn for some measure of storing user profile, much like the Pokemon Go use case. And they have very large clusters over at LinkedIn, as you can imagine. So that's another customer I like to brag about a little bit when people ask.
Are you the reason that I get 3 million emails a day from LinkedIn? Whose fault?
It's not Couchbase's fault.
And I do mean fault at this, but
it's not Couchbase's fault, but it's my fault personally. I'm the one sending all those messages to you.
You stop spamming the button. I think we can all take away something from today, which is, with scale comes responsibility for spammy button things. No, it's interesting to me. Are they a source of truth? Do they use Couchbase as a source of truth now at LinkedIn? Because I think I'm almost positive they use it to some extent for some of that now, because I think it's in your case study.
What do you mean by source of truth?
Just in terms of the where instead of just being purely that cache, you want to be able to say, pull that thing from that thing right now, and that's the thing that I know it to be. Because at the end of the day, when scale comes into play with a lot of these things, you start talking about, obviously the sort of the atomic level of those changes. And, when I think of a cache, I want the thing that's in the cache to be, I don't want to have to go behind it to go get my thing.
So LinkedIn uses a lot of Kafka with Couchbase.
Okay.
To do a lot of their big data type stuff.
Yeah, and LinkedIn, they use this for multiple use cases there. So it might be the case that they're using caching one place and using some sort of system of record another place, and using it for some big data processing in yet a third place. So they have a lot of Couchbase running at LinkedIn.
Yeah, but we're not limited to just those two customers. It's just there's a lot of people who don't want us sharing their name, so we got to be careful on that kind of stuff. But there are a lot of companies using Couchbase at very large
I would like
scales.
to shout out to one of our smaller customers actually, but they're a very valued customer. There's a company, I think they're based in England, called CNET. And they are a really cool startup doing some great stuff with photography, and they're big Couchbase advocates, which is why I'm a fan. But they actually decided to use our full text search feature, which is in preview right now, but they went ahead and used it in production anyway, which I think shows that they have tremendous confidence in what we're doing. But I just wanted to give them a shout out because they are always talking about their use of Couchbase in their product there.
Oh, that's awesome. You gotta love it, right? I mean, you expose an API and you can't guarantee what people do with it. So, but that's a really big kudos to you guys. And again, it's really been awesome learning about Couchbase today. And so as we kind of wrap up, I'm curious, is there any last words of wisdom that you'd like to dispel about Couchbase? Anything we missed?
Not words of wisdom for me. I would like to do a shameless plug if that's all right.
Oh, please.
Yeah, so there's actually a Couchbase conference coming up in San Jose, California, at the end of October. And there will be workshops, one of which that I am giving. It's a developer track for Node.js, Java, and .NET. I am actually raffling off some tickets. So if you sign up to attend Couchbase Connect in San Jose, and you put my name, Nick Raboy, as a referral, we're going to go ahead and look at that pool and raffle off some tickets. So if you'd like to attend that workshop, I definitely recommend it.
Fantastic. We'll get that in the show notes, too, so if people want to reach out and scope that
try
out.
Try to tweet that as well. And guess who's going to be at the conference and your workshop, Nick?
Who?
Me.
Yeah, awesome.
I started using Couchbase 2 months ago, so expect lots of GitHub issue questions about like things that are in the FAQs, that I should have read. So
instead of GitHub questions, maybe bring them to the forums, because the forums is definitely more monitored than
right.
The GitHub
There's forums, yeah. So I apologize for the generational lack of reading in advance. That's all.
It's all right.
You never comment on any of my stuff, Amal. Like I'm hurt.
Nobody reads docs.
Nobody reads docs.
As somebody who writes docs, nobody reads docs.
But they're important, Danny. They are massively important. I read docs.
Thank you.
I should really expand my reading options. What else did we miss? What did we not ask you that we should have asked you to talk about Couchbase?
Maybe Matt has some feedback.
Oh, geez. Like I said, there's a million things. I could go for hours.
Maybe pick one.
I'm trying to think. I usually have a slide of FAQs after every session that I get asked all the time, but I think we've covered most of them. A lot of people do ask what technology Couchbase is written in, and there's some pretty cool stuff being done there, and it's one of the things that make us sort of unique in our architecture. And Couchbase is written in a number of languages, but Erlang is one of them, great for distributed computing, and some Go in there as well, and C++. So that's a question I get asked a lot. So there's your answer.
Fantastic. Well, if people want to find you on the intertubes and out there on the World Wide Web of things, where might they look?
So I'm very active on Twitter personally. So my Twitter handle is nraboy, so my first initial and then my last name, and I'm sure you'll have it in the notes. But if you ever want to ping me on Couchbase, PWAs, whatever the reason, I love all technology, so I'd be happy to respond and help you out.
Yeah, and I'll put in a plug for myself on Twitter. I'm also pretty active there. I'm M Grove, so again, first initial, last name. And since Nick's not going to do it, I'll also put in a plug for the NoSQL Database podcast, which is primarily hosted by Nick.
Oh, yeah.
He's just too humble to plug it. And also plug out for our team Twitter account, Couchbase Dev, Couchbase DEV. So you can definitely follow that and send us feedback there if you'd like as well.
Fantastic. We'll get that stuff in the show notes, so if you're out there listening, you can go ahead and visit our guest today. Gentlemen, thank you so much for coming on and being on the show and talking about Couchbase. It's been lovely having you.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having us and get us in for the next release cycle. We have a lot of stuff to share.
We will make it a date. Danny Amal, any parting words before we wrap up here at episode number 140?
Yes.
Read the docs.
Or just,
Isn't that your closing remarks all the time, Danny?
It's mostly it. This is the hill I die on. Read the docs.
I think we need t-shirts.
Well, I believe that's a good place to wrap up. This has been episode number 140 of the Web Platform Podcast, an overview of Couchbase. We want to thank our guests, Matt and Nick, this week. Tune in next week when we talk about more things web, more things software, and we hope to see you there soon.